So that's all the introductions you guys are getting. Your institutional affiliations, with the exception of Carol. I'm going to tell one story about Carol. And this is my version. It's happened so long ago I don't remember the exact truth, but this is my version. Why do you look so nervous? So I was down at Rice University well, 4 or 5 years ago, maybe longer. And I was giving a talk there, and they know I like baseball, so they took me to a baseball game. And we were sitting behind home plate, and I was sitting next to Carol, who was then the provost at Rice. And we started talking, and I detected something familiar in the way we talked, something similar. And so the way I remember it, where are you from? She's from Delaware. I'm not. I wouldn't have known her from there. Various things. Where what jobs? We had no overlap. And finally, what college did you go to? And I went to the University of Chicago. And what class were you in? I was in the class of 1983. Oh, me too. And I also went to Chicago. What major were you? American history. Oh, me too. Who was your advisor? A guy named Neil Harris. Oh, me too. So we were in the same senior seminar, about 12 people. We were there for a year, and of course, it being the University of Chicago, we didn't know each other and don't remember each other.
And had no fun.
No, and had no fun. But the point of the story is that Chicago is one of those universities that leaves a mark on its students. And it was detectable, even in the conversation. There was something that had left a similar mark on each of us. And so that's what universities can do, have that life-altering mark, and I hope we're going to talk about that. And we're going to start I'm going to ask each of the panelists, starting with Nicholas, to talk about, when we're talking about the humanities, some way the humanities left a mark on you. It's just some personal introductory offer on what it has meant to you and how it's left a mark on you.
Well, I went to a public high school in Connecticut, and then went to college just up the road at a small liberal arts college in Middletown, Connecticut, Wesleyan, and didn't quite feel that I was ready to swim in this sea full of kids who had gone to private boarding schools and high schools, but decided to take a course that was an interdisciplinary course called Free Will and Necessity, co-taught by a behavioral psychologist who'd studied at Harvard with B.F. Skinner, and a philosopher of religion who was a specialist on Hegel and Niebuhr. And this course was just eye-opening to me. And it was a humanities course, but it was also a science course, which is actually part of why I'm invoking this. And it was basically about this tension between what it means to be human if you look at it from the point of view of experiments that actually liken humans to pigeons, as in the case of Skinner, or liken humans to forces of the greatest possible humanist power if you take a Hegelian perspective. But what I remember is this cherubic professor of religion talking about Niebuhr and Hegel, making us read Ernst Cassirer's Essay on Man, and I remember thinking that was going to lead me to drop out of college in my second week, while debating the implications of experiments that were just riveting in the way in which they suggested the extent to which you can train pigeons to do things that are analogous to the ways in which humans behave. And of course, this is then, there's neuroscience now, but it's the same principle. And by the end of this course, I realized a couple of things. First, that I couldn't tell who won the debate, and that actually was one of the great insights of the course. They were both compelling, they were both persuasive, and they were both right. And I realized that even though my predilection was Hegel, Niebuhr, Cassirer, that I actually had to, when thinking about the question what it means to be human, understand the liberal arts in a much broader sense than ever before. But it was that fundamental encounter with completely divergent attitudes, beliefs, and even evidence in the context of a humanistic encounter in a classroom with 12 other kids around the table that I think really changed the way in which I thought about what I was going to do in college and what I might do with my life.
So I'll tell my college story. I went to Swarthmore College, and I like to say that I majored in everything sequentially. Started off pre-med and then actually spent a lot of time studying English and philosophy, which I just loved. In a lot of poetry, I really like poetry. When I was a junior, I decided that I needed to have something practical on my transcript, and I took Introduction to Economics. It was a full year sequence in my junior year, and I fell in love with it. I mean, not because it was practical, but just because I thought it was intellectually really interesting. It sort of combined a lot of the logic that I was doing in philosophy, but it applied it to a very, very important set of issues and policy issues that I cared a lot about. So I moved away from the humanities. Now, I'll tell you why I think studying the humanities as I did was so important to me. One is, again, if you think about the way I think about economics, maybe is different than the way a lot of people do. The definition of economics is the allocation of scarce resources across competing ends, which is really boring. And I think of economics as trying to think of how you can use markets to improve human welfare. And if you want to improve human welfare, you have to understand the human condition. And that you get from doing many other things than studying economics. When it came time to write my doctoral dissertation, I was doing a lot of empirical work in different areas, and I was trying to figure out what to do. And I remembered actually there's a canto by Ezra Pound called On Usury, which is basically describing a system of credit market restrictions and interest rate ceilings that were in effect in Italy a very long time ago. So I did my dissertation on interest rate ceilings, so it was inspired by Ezra Pound. Yeah.
Okay, Carol.
I think my story is sort of the reverse of yours, Christina. I went to Chicago fully convinced that I would be a lawyer. I grew up in Delaware where every adult I knew was a lawyer, mostly practicing corporate law. And my father had been a judge on all three state courts in Delaware. So I really had in mind what I wanted to do. And what happened was, through a course in Western civilization for which I had spent the night outside to get in. It was a very popular course, and Chicago had a tradition of standing in line, all night to register for the classes that you wanted, and I had done that for this Western Civ class. What I discovered was that the questions I cared about most were best addressed, not so much answered as addressed, through modes of inquiry that I learned in that class. And that was both a process for me of self-discovery, so encountering 3 or 4 lines in Virgil that exactly capture and describe an emotion that I believed I had felt, but had been unable to recognize as such until I read Virgil. And then the questions that the texts we read in that class were poised to help us think through. So how do you treat other people ethically in a world where people have such radically different views of right and wrong? Or what's the relationship between, or how do we reimagine the relationship between public space and private space so that people who historically have been excluded from public space can fully participate? The questions that mattered the most to me were best addressed through the modes of inquiry I learned in what I would call a multidisciplinary Western civilization class. So I think that was what triggered my interest. And then we were in college when Harold Washington ran for mayor, and the combination of watching that race and rereading over and over again a story by Alice Walker called Advancing Luna, and what I learned about my own limitations ethically through that experience, which is too long to go into now because they are many, really converted me to the humanities and away from law school, which is definitely where I was headed.
Now, just to take one extra question, do you remember the letter of Carl Weintraub, the professor of that class? Do you remember it well enough to summarize it?
So the professor of this class, who is a very famous guy at Chicago, his name was Carl Weintraub. He had taught Western Civ there for a long time, and he had gone to Chicago. All 3 of his degrees were from Chicago. Refugee, came over after World War II, got his bachelor's degree in like 6 months, because at Chicago you could get your degree by examination at that time. And he wrote me a letter when I was in graduate school at Princeton, about teaching. And the letter was about how hard it is to do. And he said, how can I open up my students who are so eager to find the right answer to the experience of vulnerability that the authors they are studying had. So if you can't feel the power of Pericles' love for the city, how are you ever going to understand the funeral oration? If you can't grasp Augustine's deep sense of what it means to be a creature in the face of a creator, how are you ever going to understand the Confessions and everything that comes after that? And it was about the incredible effort that goes into opening up students to that experience of vulnerability and how exhausting it is, and how at some level you're never really sure that you've actually been successful, and yet you keep doing it. And it was a powerful testament both to the importance of teaching, but also to the kind of deep personal vulnerability that this man, who I swear was this big, Teutonic, well-educated man, and if you had told us when we were in his class that he felt at all vulnerable to us, he taught Socratically, Miss Quillen, that is the stupidest thing I've ever heard anyone say. I mean, he didn't strike me as vulnerable. So I think learning that about him was really important for my own later engagement with students.
Okay, so the roadmap ahead for the next little while until we open up the floors. First, the title of our session is Will the Humanities Be Extinct by 2024? And I don't know how literally we want to take that, but it's based on the presupposition they're in trouble or in decline. So I thought first we'd do a little sociology. You could each describe on your own campuses and maybe nationwide what the state of the humanities is. Are they in decline, and what are the prospects of students who go into them? And then we could talk about what they're for and what mark you're trying to leave on students with the humanities. So Nicholas, let's start with you with a sociological question. Berkeley, big, very prestigious state university. Are people leaving the humanities? Are the budgets and enrollments declining? Is interest declining? You feel a loss of mojo over there?
At Berkeley, there's a lot of mojo
Yeah.
to go around, and it
too.
extends to the humanities, believe me. It's been something I've been looking for. I just moved there a year ago from Columbia. Columbia, traditionally known for its humanities, lots of humanities majors, and also a core curriculum that basically takes up 2 of the 4 years with courses that are predominantly humanistic. So when I moved to Berkeley, aside from getting some questions, what is a humanist like you doing, leading a great university with great science and great engineering, and I had to say, well, I've done some of this before. I did, of course, try to figure out what the state of affairs were on campus. On the one hand, the humanities continue to draw lots of majors. There are lots of majors in English and philosophy and in history, which is my principal discipline. I'm also an anthropologist, but there was nevertheless this recurrent and very regularly expressed worry. What am I going to do if I actually major in English? Will I get a job? And in fact, I was just sitting on the stage an hour ago talking with heads of different community colleges, and Anthony Carnival, who is a higher education specialist, was talking. And indeed, the correlation between getting jobs and majors is very powerful now. And students at Berkeley and everywhere else are appropriately concerned about what their prospects are. Now, we often at Berkeley compare ourselves, or at least we look across the bay at Stanford. And I was just talking, in fact, to John Hennessy there, and it turns out that this year there are only 60 majors in English at Stanford. So even in a place where you can sort of assume that students are going to get jobs, they are just leaving the humanities in droves. And I was struck because that isn't actually happening at Berkeley. Students are staying with it. They are staying with their passion. We tell them constantly, do what your passion leads you to do. A lot of Berkeley students will graduate from college and go into public service, more Teach for America, Peace Corps volunteers, in fact, than any other campus in the US. It's a very strong ethos for public service and indeed for following your dream. But, they want to get jobs, and they need to get jobs. So I think that what we see increasingly is going to be reflected in the numbers, that there will be growing pressure on students to think about, at the very least, a double major. And in fact, there is a kind of explosion of double majors. You'll see a lot of students who will major in philosophy and economics. Economics in particular, it's within the same college. But there are a lot of students who would love to be able to major in some kind of computer science engineering and something in the humanities. And this is actually a problem because of the way in which engineering certification has been set up. The Ivy League does it differently and actually allows students to do a slightly broader curriculum at the risk of not getting fully certified in comparison with other engineering degrees. But certainly, to respond to the sociology of things, yes, there is a problem. It hasn't yet manifested itself completely in the way of distributing numbers across majors and curricula, but it's beginning to be felt.
Just quickly, going from New York to the Bay Area, is there just a startup culture among the students? Are they, in the Bay Area, are they more into startups, and in Columbia more into finance? Do you detect that?
Well, the tradition at Columbia is you read Aristotle and then you go to Goldman Sachs. The dream at Berkeley is to do social work and then go work for Google or Facebook. So yeah, all the stereotypes have a lot of truth to them. What I do find interesting is that at Berkeley, about 70% of the students are taking some computer science across the curriculum. And this, I think, is a national phenomenon. At Stanford, it's 90%, but that's Stanford. But we're actually trying to introduce a course in data science and data analytics into the core liberal arts and sciences curriculum so that every student, whether they're doing English or whatever, will have a sense of at least how you might begin to think about representing the content that you write, and of course it's just content, but actually coding it and mounting the platform you need to actually get it out there too.
Okay, Christina, you're an economist. Do you have data for us?
Well, I did look at some numbers before I came. You know, it's interesting because you can look at the experience of any one university and you see different trends. And, to some extent, you have to realize we control our own trends. We do have admissions offices that decide who should come, and we make investment decisions. Brown is down to about 20% of the majors are in the humanities. Some decline over the last decade, in large part because Brown has been building in sciences and engineering, and I think so I wouldn't extrapolate that nationally. When you look at national data on the fraction of BAs that are in humanities, honestly, it doesn't show a crisis. If you look at the data, they're really interesting, and I hadn't done it before I was preparing for this panel. About 10% of BAs were in the humanities in 1950. There was then this huge boom, climbed up to about 17% at the peak in 1968, but then by 1975 was down to under 10%, and it's been there ever since. Sort of ups and downs, and it's very, it goes with the business cycle. When there's higher unemployment, students move out of the humanities. When there's lower unemployment, they move back in. So I think it makes sense that we're worried about it now because we've had a bad period of, one of the largest recessions in ages and then a jobless recovery. Do we think that's going to last forever? I certainly hope not. The other thing that's interesting, if you go back even farther historically and you read what people were writing about, around the time of the Great Depression, it was very similar. It was sort of, why are you wasting your time on this useless knowledge? Go out and do something practical. So, I'm a big believer in the value of the humanities. I think, the real question is whether something fundamental has changed that is going to drive things in a different direction than it has for the past 40 years. I don't really see any reason to think that's true, so I'm probably less pessimistic than others. I have, over the past 5 years, seen, and I was chair of an economics department at Princeton, when enrollments went from, or number of majors went from in the 80s up to about 200. And the same thing has happened to Brown, at Harvard, at most of the colleges I've looked at. And I think that's really recession driven. Those numbers are starting to drop in a lot of places. So we're coming back into a different place. And frankly, I think that's a good thing. People should go into economics if they love economics, not just because they think they need to get a job. So I'm not that pessimistic. I'm really not.
What about the outcomes of humanities majors?
So again, so this is the interesting thing. For years and years, there's been an earnings gap between people who graduate with degrees in the humanities and people in the sciences, right? And it's, the return to a degree in the humanities, economic return, is still very high, but it's not as high as it would be if you majored in engineering, right? So what's happened in the US that is fascinating is because of this increase in income inequality, what it's doing is spreading out the salary distribution. So actually the gap between scientists and engineers and humanists is getting bigger, as it is, and also the gap between people with college degrees and without college degrees is getting bigger. It's just part of growing inequality. So one question would be, if that continues, will we then start to see real declines in the demand of students to go into the humanistic disciplines?
Carol, you lead a prestigious liberal arts, I suppose you're a liberal arts college. Do you find it, let me ask you first, generally reflect on what's happening on campus, but also what about fundraising? Do you find it easier or harder to raise money for the humanities compared to the sciences and things like that?
So I'll answer the fundraising question second. I think, so Davidson, because we're a college and we only have undergraduate students, we don't have any graduate students. And because we have great students, so our humanities majors are quantitatively able. We are able to build an amazing group of students to bring in every year. Our faculty create curricula that draws the students to them. So the invitation to the faculty, it's also much easier in a small institution to create more collaboration across disciplines and across departments and across fields and across areas of inquiry. So at Davidson, we really try to do that. And when faculty in a particular department see that they want students, they need students to help them. Their students are their primarily intellectual interlocutors. There are no graduate students. So they want students. And so they create, I would say, interesting spaces, and the students come. So I see, I wouldn't say that it's driven by enrollment, but I would say that there's a kind of imperative at a college for faculty who want to have rich intellectual lives to create a space for students, and the students will come there. So in the same way we were talking at breakfast about neuroscience, which is a very popular major at Davidson and probably everywhere, that is an interesting space because the questions that the faculty are engaged in are interesting to the students. So we do the same thing in the humanities. We have a great course that's taught by an English professor and a biology professor that's called Representing HIV/AIDS, where the students learn, and the bio professor studies vaccines, and the English professor studies HIV as a cultural and social phenomenon that is represented in cultural life in various ways. And the students who take that get both of those perspectives. But they created that class in the interest of building that intellectual community of students for their own intellectual enrichment. So on our campus, when students demonstrate a lack of interest in something, pretty quickly there's curricular innovation around it because the faculty need the students for their intellectual life. In terms of fundraising, I think it just depends on, I would say the quick answer is no. It depends on the constituency. And so there are students and alumni from Davidson who remember this famous humanities sequence at Davidson and want to support that. And there are people who are more interested in computer science and data analytics and want to make sure that our students have the opportunity to learn about that as well.
I'm going to ask you a challenge, a criticism to the two university presidents in the form of a question. Really, it's going to be an accusation.
Okay.
And so I went to a big research university. I teach at a big research university. And yet if I had a child, as indeed I've had, who were going to major in the humanities and liberal arts, I would tell them not to go to a university, but to go to a liberal arts college. Because in my observation across the country, the classes can be small at all these schools, but the chances of having dinner at your professor's home are much higher, in my view, at a liberal arts college than a university because the graduate students aren't there. and just the psychic priority on teaching is higher in a college than in a university. Do you agree?
Who goes first? I'll go first on that, which is I disagree. I really do. So, but let me put it a different way. I went to a small college, and I loved the experience that I had there. And I do think places like Davidson, Swarthmore, Wesleyan, they're terrific. I think the challenge, and one of the reasons I was drawn to Brown is a place that really places a very high value on undergraduate education. I was a little bit afraid when I went there that it was sort of a fiction. It was sort of the myth that they tell prospective students, but then when you get there, you find out it's not true. And it's actually true. So, I've recruited some people in the past year, a new faculty member from MIT who was teaching a graduate course, and then a large number of undergraduates sort of talked their way in. And so this combined group of undergraduates, graduate students, and a faculty member, he said it was the best teaching he's ever done in his life. So to me, the challenge is how do you create a great and maintain a great research university that also is terrific for undergraduate students. It's not a natural, right? So it doesn't have to happen, but I think if you're purposeful about it, you can make it happen.
We, of course, have been rehearsing for years and years and years this tension between research and teaching. It was a tension when the university was created, in a sense, when the American university was created out of a set of colleges in the mid and late 19th century. And a real concern that the two were incompatible. And of course, it's been cyclic over the years in terms of how it's worked out. But I went to a small liberal arts college. I loved it. I did have dinner often in faculty homes. There wasn't much else for the faculty to do in Middletown. But, sorry?
They can shop at Bob's, discount store. Go ahead.
It wasn't there in '68. But on the other hand, I spent time in Chicago too as a graduate student, and even in Chicago I saw the kind of preoccupation of many of the star professors, not Carl Weintraub, but lots of others with their graduate students and graduate training. But a couple of things. First, Brown is actually well known for its commitment to undergraduate teaching and undergraduate education. Berkeley has always been best known for its research and for its graduate programs, top ranked in almost every program across virtually every field. And indeed, when I went there, one of the things I did was to announce an initiative in undergraduate education precisely to focus on what I felt to be one of the public obligations of a university that is public as well as excellent, like Berkeley, namely to really provide a set of experiences for undergraduates, both in the classroom and outside, that would be every bit as compelling, every bit as productive as the kind of experience I had at Wesleyan, but not discount the fact that they're in a research university with a lot of people with a lot of things going on. And what I've discovered is that things were actually much better than I thought. I mean, I'm still pressing forward with an undergraduate initiative, and I'm hoping to raise a lot of money for it. But I'm struck that students learn from each other. They learn from engagement with the kinds of things going on, not just on campus, but in a very vital community, some of which draws them into startup kinds of things, some of which draws them into real commitments for public service, some of which draws them into protesting the chancellor, which is part of campus life at Berkeley. But they also, almost all of them, engage in research. And the strongest endorsement I can give for undergraduate education in a research university is that research itself is one of the best things we can teach students how to do. Whatever they go on to do, if they have really participated, whether in an engineering lab or in a social science project, or in any number of things in the humanities in a research project, they're learning some of the skills they can use in financial services and IT, but indeed in just about anything else. Now, the trick, of course, is to make sure they're really doing research, not just attaching themselves on in some kind of clerical sense to a lab or whatever. But I think I have been persuaded that research over the course of a career, but especially at Berkeley, that the kind of high-minded rhetoric around teaching and research is actually true.
Now let's switch.
Can I
Would
just
you
ask one?
go ahead?
So I would say, I mean, I just want to, I think, and I was educated at research institutions, Chicago and Princeton, and taught at one for a long time. I think research happens at great liberal arts colleges, and it's federally funded research, and it happens in a way that makes the students the focus of it. So that one reason why liberal arts colleges send students for PhD programs in high numbers is that they have had this experience of doing original work. I read a thesis written in history written by one of our graduates who's now in London studying, although she does not want to get a PhD. And her undergraduate thesis, and this was true at Princeton, I'm sure, could have been a dissertation. I mean, it was such a, she went to France, she worked in archives, she wrote a phenomenal original piece of work as a senior in college. And I think the opportunity to that isn't specific to research institutions. I think it's those opportunities abound at your institutions. But it's not, I think they also abound at places like Davidson in a way that serves some students really, really effectively.
Mm-hmm.
Let me make another accusation. So when we were at Chicago, we were lucky enough to have not only Weintraub, but others, professors who, some of whom were European refugees, but not all, but who treated the humanities as they were a secular priesthood. And the books they were teaching were there to improve your moral life. And that you were going to learn about love from Socrates, you were going to learn about power and cruelty from Machiavelli, you were going to learn about marriage from George Eliot, you were going to learn about how history happens from Tolstoy, and these were the truths by which you would live, and truths with a capital T. And that therefore they were really offering you something really big, the magic keys to life. And in my observation, the humanities department have given up a lot of that, the magic keys to your internal life, and they've become interested in the external issues of race, class, and gender. And when you get interested in the external, you're really playing off the humanities' core strength. And students are going to lose interest, and the humanities are going to become more of a dry academic discipline arguing about the meaning of language than really a missionary enterprise. And in my view, when I was in college, if you said someone was an English major, that meant they were among the smartest people on campus. Now, I don't think that's true. That's not the stereotype anymore. So that's my second accusation, that the humanities have squandered some of the magnetism they had from being part of a sacred mission.
That's a very Chicago observation, I have to say.
Is that an
Yeah,
insult or a
absolutely.
compliment? Well, that's a way to ask, do you think the humanities ever did that? And what do you think your departments, you're paying a lot of money for these people to teach. What are they doing? What are you hoping to do?
Well, I mean, I do think that the humanities departments generally have broadened from the kind of classical canon and have embraced a broader global vision of the humanities, which frankly I think is terrific. I would not characterize them as being driven largely by issues of race, class, and gender. I think that more in, some history departments, not in other history departments, American studies departments maybe, but English and philosophy, those are still English and philosophy. They may not be reading the same books you read when you were an undergraduate, but you can learn a lot about marriage by reading things frankly, George Eliot I would not read as a guide to marriage, but that's just my own.
Now we're really getting into it.
Yeah, but I think that they're good courses, and they're students that are learning a lot from them about themselves, about life, and about the human condition. Nick, you may disagree with me, but.
No, I don't disagree at all. I went to Chicago as a graduate student, and I saw that even in the two departments where I spent most of my time, it was a secular priesthood for them as well. And it's a very compelling thing to be around. And you have only to read Bellow, Herzog, and so on to have a sense of how that worked. You also have only to read Bellow's, Herzog to see what the problems are. So, I went to college in 1968, and I read Hegel and I read Cassirer and I read incredible literature, and I struggled with all of this. But then I went and did a study abroad program in India, and then I became interested in expanding my own sense of scholarly pursuits, and became a historian and anthropologist of India. And in that context, became very frustrated with some of the ways in which the canon was being taught, and not the passion with which it was taught, and not actually what was being taught, but how it was being taught, and the fact that it was neither, in some sense, attentive to some of the historical conditions that had produced the sorts of effects and results that the canon embodied, but also that it simply hierarchized everybody and everything in all parts of the world. Whether in some sense repeating the old adage of Thomas Babington Macaulay that a single shelf in the library of an Englishman is worth the entirety of all the literature in Asia. Well, it had been toned down a little bit, but that was still the feeling one had. And it became, a great interest to me. For example, I learned in the context of my work on India that Shakespeare was installed in the curriculum as the kind of great man of English letters only in India, first in India. First in India because it had, of course, been the Greeks, and the British, when they were teaching the classics, began to get a little bit embarrassed about the fact that they couldn't have British great authors and great minds. And so increasingly, it's not that Shakespeare wasn't known, it wasn't that he wasn't important, but he was installed at a particular level in the curriculum in the universities of Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras. And it became interesting to me that in some sense, all canons get formed that way. And they all have political kinds of purposes and so on. So I was a participant in my writing and my scholarship and my teaching in the culture wars. And in my younger days, I was very passionate about that fight. Now I sit in a different position, and I am at a different age, and I do worry that we've lost some of the sense of the absolute critical importance of the moral encounters that are part of any humanistic education, which can be with a lot of different canons, with a lot of different texts, with a lot of different traditions, although I do believe that there are some traditions that are more important to learn, partly because they can be shared in common than others. And I'm trying at this point in life to try to balance my sense of how these trajectories within and real tensions between different kinds of emphases in the study of culture have become part of the problem. I don't think they have to continue to be. I think increasingly they're not. And I hope that a more capacious kind of cultural study, in some sense, can then be translated, whatever students go on to do, as an important part of their moral education in the same sense that you had at Chicago.
Okay. Carol, what are you trying to do with the humanities?
I think the way that you pose that question, with all due respect.
I was pretty sure my accusations were not going to be blindly accepted.
I mean, conflates two issues. One is the issue of the urgency and the seriousness of the questions that you're asking, and the second is the text that you're using to try to address them, right? So there's the question of, does everybody need to take Western Civ as we took it and learn the torch theory of civilization, right? Greece to Rome, to Italy, to England, to the United States, or whatever version of that you want to tell. And speaking as someone who loved that class, or are there important, serious questions that are part of being an engaged human being in a society that depends upon your effort for its perpetuation that you need somewhere to have a space to address? And the form of those questions changes, but the seriousness of them doesn't. And I think we have, in some sense, failed to communicate to our students, and this was where vulnerability comes in. And what I really learned from Jacques Weintraub was, your kids have to see why you care. And if you're standing up there saying stuff, they're not going to care. And what he did for us was show us, he believed that history was what stood between civilization and barbarism, and that it was his job to prevent anything like the rise of National Socialism from ever happening again, and we were his means. So there is a kind of urgency to that task that I think is important. So if you care about anti-racism, or if you care about income inequality, or if you care about feminism, and you can communicate why, and not just, I say, take refuge in the language of critique, then the humanities are vibrant. And so I think, So I think what we try to do is communicate that to ourselves. When I interview, I've learned so much in my time at Davidson about higher education that I didn't know before. When I talk to every potential faculty member. It's a tradition at this small institution. So every potential job candidate I get to meet, and I ask completely different questions than I used to ask. So I ask, what do you work on? I work on early childhood literacy. Why does it matter to you? I want to ensure that every American child learns how to read by the time they're in 3rd grade. How, in an introductory psychology course, are you going to communicate that to your freshmen? How are you going to share that passion with freshmen who know nothing? And if they can tell me how they would do that, what intro psychology course they would design so that happened, then they would be a great professor at Davidson. If they can't, if they're going to teach somebody else's course or use somebody else's syllabus, or, then it's not going to work.
Okay, audience has questions. Anybody out there have a question? Let's start in the back. I see a pinkish, purplish shirt.
Hi, Jim Shell.
There's a mic coming from behind.
So you talked about the shift in majors, but you didn't really talk about the role of college affordability and cost in causing people to shy away from the humanities. And then while I'm standing up, the kind of passion and purpose that you talked about in the humanities oftentimes is seeded before students arrive on college campuses. And so I'm wondering what role you see in getting that kind of inspiration back into the K-12 system so people show up ready.
Anybody?
You're all looking at me. No, well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
So I think it's important. So Davidson is committed to being available to all talented students, so need blind, and we meet financial need. Now, there are not a lot of institutions in that position who are able to do that, and I'm not, to be honest with you, sure how exactly we're going to pay for it going forward, but it's an ethical commitment on the part of the institution. So affordability, in that sense, I think we have a deep commitment to. I think it's also on us to control the escalation of the cost, just generally. In terms of K-12, that is our pipeline. So we need to find ways to work more effectively with high school teachers. And I mean work with them, not tell them what to do. So we try to find ways of working with our high school teachers in our area, in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, to figure out what's the right articulation of that experience so that when students, particularly those from underserved schools, come to Davidson, they are able to, they are comfortable, I would say, asking the questions that matter the most to them and interested in that as an exploration. But our mission is leadership and service. So we have a very clear sense of what we do and why. That said, my husband was a computer scientist, and I have hired more computer scientists at Davidson than in any other field, partly because the relationship between the humanistic disciplines and computation and quantitative analysis is an interesting area of inquiry, and partly because it's an important thing for, like as you're saying, for everyone to know, right? And so I don't know if I answered your question, but these guys will do a better job.
Can I just say something about the question of affordability? It's a huge issue. We think about it all the time. As Carol said, it's there are the institutions we represent are very proactive in terms both of recruiting students from a wide variety of schools and backgrounds, and also providing financial aid. But I am going to say, since we've been talking almost exclusively about private institutions here, something about the fact that Berkeley is a public institution. I found it quite remarkable when I went there that 36% of its undergraduates are Pell Grant eligible. And in fact, on the Berkeley campus alone, there are as many Pell Grant students as there are in the entire Ivy League. And it's a remarkable fact that I never came to appreciate. That's just Berkeley. There are 8 other UC campuses that have undergraduates. And 40% of the students pay no tuition, even though the tuition itself for in-state students is under $13,000. People remember having gone there in the day when it was $75 a quarter. It's still, relative to others, a great bargain. So, but nevertheless, the issue of how we're going to continue to pay for this, how we're going to make sure that we have students at Berkeley who get financial aid, they have all kinds of services, and they still can't afford to stay in school because they're paying their mother's rent in Oakland. Because that's what you do if your mom needs it. And the kinds of structural issues that are part of our society today, we're often asked to fix in the university. But in fact, what we're doing is simply trying to engage it as best we can on a case-by-case basis. And that includes, of course, K through 12 education. We still have at Berkeley an overwhelming predominance of public school kids who come, and we deal. It's harder, but you take what you can. You take as your mission what you can do, and then try to, of course, direct attention to some of the challenges we all face in terms of K through 12 education across this nation.
Okay, let's get some more questions right here in the front. Start and I'll repeat it. Go ahead.
What are you finding in your MOOC enrollment? In the MOOC enrollment, is it sort of consistent with the undergraduate? Do they tend more towards the humanities perhaps than the undergraduate trends? Are there anything to be learned about that? Do we ultimately gravitate back to the humanities to the extent that the participants in the MOOC programs are people who have already gone through college education?
So I'd like, we do one MOOC. We're starting to experiment with MOOCs. We're doing Coursera, we've done a number, we're doing more, and doing a number of other kind of experiments in different types of online learning. But one thing that's really addresses your question is one of the MOOCs we did is a course called The Fiction of the Relationship, which is taught by a very prominent English professor at Brown who's been around forever, Arnold Weinstein, and he taught this course. It's a very famous course at Brown, and he taught it as his MOOC. And he made the following observations. One is the quality of the work that the students in the MOOC were doing was not as good as the quality of work of the Brown students, and they were students from all over the world. What he loved was the quality of the discussion. So this was a course about relationships. It's about love and how people get along. And there are limitations to how much you can get out of a conversation about relationships with 19-year-olds. They have limited experience. And so these online conversations were just rich and fascinating. So what he's doing now is he's teaching the course at Brown with our students while he's running the MOOC, so that the Brown students can participate in these global discussions about these really interesting books. So I think that some of the humanities courses really lend themselves to this kind of vehicle. We've also had a lot of success, not in the MOOC arena, but just the online arena, virtual arena, in teaching writing. And that's an area where you can all be in different locations, but you can be writing, you can be sharing your writing, you can comment on each other's writing. So, much more easily than laboratory courses, the humanities are in good shape for some of the really interesting innovations that we're doing in higher education.
Let's go. Do I see any other in the back? I see two back. I'm picking the farthest ones for you.
Hi, thank you all very much. So recently it seems like we've seen a trend in service learning and connecting students' classroom experience to their local community experience. And so I was just wondering what you all see for the humanities, and if service learning is a way to draw students into the humanities, and what that might look like, or what you all are doing on your campuses.
So we have a number, an increasing growing number of community-based learning classes where the work of the class comes from the community. And that could be anything from a math modeling problem to a distribution of resources problem to a problem about how to deliver healthcare in a certain context to a certain population. So the questions are varied. Most of those classes are multidisciplinary in terms of student interest. So the students come into them with lots of different kinds of interests, and they work in teams. So one of the advantages, from my perspective, of community-based learning classes is that students learn from each other a variety of disciplinary perspectives as they're trying to solve a real problem. And the world is actually different as a result of their labor, right? So they've actually solved a problem and done something. So I see that less as a trend that's tied specifically to the humanities, and much more as a trend that as us trying to lower the boundaries between what happens on our campus and what happens after, as a way of getting our students ready to have maximum impact in the world when they leave. Because ultimately, the measure of our value as an institution is the impact that we as an institution and that our graduates have in the world. That is the ultimate measure of our effectiveness for the society that supports us through tax breaks and all these other reasons. So I think that is helpful in maximizing their impact and helping them understand what really matters to them. I don't think it's specific to the humanities, although we've had great humanistic type projects that have been a part of that.
But I think that nevertheless it is a challenge. I don't really want to sit here and be part of the panel and not say there aren't serious crises in the humanities. There are. And one area, I think, in which that manifests itself is that we have a lot of students who engage in work in high schools, and very challenged high schools in Oakland and Richmond and elsewhere, go in to do community work. Some teach in prisons, and that's been a long-standing interest on the part of many faculty. There's some just incredibly stirring stories of people in prisons who take a course in the humanities, and it actually completely changes their lives. But the truth is, nevertheless, that when you're going into low-income areas where undermatching is your first problem, but just one of many, undermatching being the likely fact that students of very high aptitude and very high performance who are in low-income backgrounds, they simply won't go very far to college. They won't go to a college that they can get into. They'll go to a local community college and so on. That they also tend to think of education as being vocational, technical, and indeed there's stress on STEM for understandable reasons across the board, including by President Obama and the White House and the whole initiative around the new report card, about which I think we're going to hear later this afternoon something. But I think it's important that we continue our sense of how the humanities, not in terms of recruiting English majors. I mean, I love English majors, but that's not the core of what the humanities is all about. Is seen as something that is also part of our mission for outreach and part of our ultimate mission in relationship to the kinds of things that we say about a liberal arts education, which is to say that it's good for democracy, that it is part of the social good, that it actually belongs in the category of the public good and not just as a private benefit. And there, I think, our outreach has to therefore include, as part of its fundamental mission, humanistic goals, subjects, and efforts.
Okay, I think there was one more question right there. It's on.
Okay. To your point, Chancellor Dirks, and this has been on my mind, and especially in sort of trying to create this session. We've talked for years at the Aspen Ideas Festival with members of the Supreme Court who have fretted that American students don't know anything about civics. And I'm worried with the stress on reading and writing and arithmetic now that, in fact, we're growing a nation of students who don't understand the basic principles of our democracy. And I think we see it being played out in a number of ways. It's why Harvard University, after the recession, the crash, actually went back and looked at itself introspectively and said, you know, we're part of the problem because we're not teaching our business students ethics.
Right.
And I wonder, so where I'm going is, if our K through 12 across the country is not doing the job, and we're expecting universities now to teach us democracy and about our civic institutions, to prepare us for the world of sciences, to think critically about who we are as human beings, to David's point about morality, to behave ethically, do you have a set of core requirements that at least begin to build those foundations for students that may have never had any of it?
Well, you know, I come from Columbia, which does have as part of its core, in fact, a kind of fundamental course in the history of political theory, right up to the present. And there are courses like that at Berkeley. They're not part of a core. And I actually have begun discussions with faculty there about perhaps finding, if not a core curriculum, a set of courses that would fulfill the objectives that a core curriculum could be part of, but other kinds of curricula could accomplish, precisely for this reason. Precisely because there is this kind of, I think, growing disinterest and certainly miseducation in what it means. I mean, what we heard yesterday in the conversation with Hillary Clinton, that compromise is actually part of what makes politics work, not something that is about selling out or becoming impure. By the same token, you know, I'm very, very interested not just in expanding our. May seem like a difficult segue, but we talked about computer science and how important it is for our students to know something about computation. At the same time, I think it's urgent that students who are going into a world where computational kinds of knowledge are going to determine so much more than they ever did before, that they take the sense of both democracy, concerns about privacy, concerns about agency, about the things that I was learning about in my freshman humanities course, and bring them to, and also concerns about text and the complicated nature and why it is that an algorithm is not a neutral document, but actually is constructed for particular purposes with certain kinds of effects in terms of how everything from search to big data actually produces evidence-based knowledge, and brings to that this kind of both informed and humanistic set of perspectives. And I think we're between you know, things that are happening across our polity and things that are happening in relationship to the growth of technology at risk of having the humanities really, really disappear at perhaps the most urgent time of all.
We're sort of out of time, but just quick words from.
So I think part of it is ensuring that the curriculum ensures that every student has the experience, some sort of experience that will at least help them learn the basics of civic engagement in the context of democratic society. But residential institutions also offer students the opportunity to build those communities and actually to live and experience what it's like to try to create a certain kind of community with shared sense of purpose. And to the extent that we can create that environment for our students by the way we structure by the autonomy we give them to structure their world in the context of an institution of learning, I think that is one reason why I place such a high value on residential education, or at least that experience. Whether or not Minerva may pull it off, I don't know. There might be other ways to deliver it, but that experience is crucial to developing a genuine sense of democratic obligation.
Right. And I would add to that, you know, this idea of engaged learning, which you talked about before, and Brown is investing a lot in that too. Right. You know, having students go out into the community and they're working on really important problems. They're engaging with, policy leaders in our community. They do that on a regular basis, and they learn they have to want to learn this. And so if you get them involved through an issue that they're passionate about, I think they can learn it better than any sort of obligatory course on civics that people dread and sort of drag themselves through. So we have to do this, but we have to do it in a way that works for them.
Okay, I cover a lot of institutions, and I actually think the universities actually are in pretty awesome shape. I think actually the American universities are astounding, especially, I mean, you guys are top 10 schools, so it's easy for you guys. But I do think they're extremely successful institutions, and we've seen glimpses of that today. Thank you. Brown, Davidson, Berkeley.